Hey guys, TheAirsoftTech here. Today we're going to be covering basic level maintenance. The kind of maintenance you should be doing on your gun every 6 months to a year of use, depending on your level of use. If you're playing Airsoft every single month, pretty regularly, heavy on like a high performance platform, this is something you should do probably every 6 months. But if you're playing Airsoft every other month on a less high performance platform, then this is something you can get away with doing probably once a year. So without further ado, let's get down to it. Let's talk about basic level maintenance. So here I have my trusty ICS M4 platform. I'll be honest, I've not done maintenance on this gun for the better part of 3 years. I've opened it up since in that time frame, but I've not really done any maintenance. I think I opened it up one time 2 years ago or a year and a half ago to make sure that everything still looked fine, but I didn't actually do any maintenance. And as you guys know, this gun is not necessarily, I wouldn't call it a high performance gun in the gearbox wise, but it definitely would have some wear and tear if it wasn't tuned up correctly and maintained well. So I'm gonna check it out. We're gonna see what all it needs done, and we'll do some basic maintenance. So yeah, let's break it open and get down to it. So as I'm taking down the gun, I'm noticing that the first thing I get to is the electrical system and electrical component here. In this gun, I have a MOSFET. For the most part, your electrical wiring and your setup is not going to really need a whole lot of maintenance. The biggest thing you should be concerned about with the electrical system is a couple of things in your trigger components and your motor, which if you have a MOSFET like this, almost all that isn't going to matter, except for maybe the motor. Motors just build up a lot of gunk and just junk in them, and so cleaning that out is more of an advanced level thing, I would label it as. So we're not going to really cover a whole lot of that today. I want to make a whole separate video about motors, and so it'll make that video a little bit longer and more cohesive and about motors and how to clean them. So this video isn't going to cover how to clean motors, but for the most part, motors don't necessarily need cleaned. They benefit from it, but you can get away with not doing it. The thing we will cover is the trigger system, though, once we get inside the gearbox. But for now, as we're taking out the gun, there's no maintenance that needs done here. Alright, so moving on to the rest of the gun, the ICS M4 version 2 style gearbox is super easy to do maintenance on and makes this video super easy to do because of the split gearbox design. So, talk about the electrical system a little bit. We'll get more into that when we get actually into the gearbox, like I said earlier. The next thing I want to take a look at is the motor. I said I wouldn't talk a whole lot about this because a lot of things about the motor for maintenance are more in-depth than what I could cover in this video reasonably. So the only thing I want you to take a look at and notice here is I want you to make sure your brushes still look good. By good, I mean that they still have a little bit of brush to them, a little bit of material to them, and that the wires on top look good, the same color that you got them, and that they're not burnt out or something. Next thing is to look at the motor pinion gear. If it's wearing out or misshaped, or each tooth is different from the other ones, like meaning that there's some sort of wear going on, then you want to figure out where that's coming from. This one looks pretty good, looks about like the day I got it. It's got a little bit of scarring on it, and that's just from motor adjusting to get the right height and everything. So, alright, so what I look at in terms of wear with the hop-up unit is I look down the center of it and I make sure that my R-hop or whatever you have in your current setup is still even. If it's still even, that's awesome. That means your patch is still good. That means that your nub is still pretty good. If you've not noticed that you're having to increase your hop-up unit to get the same range over time, then your nub should probably still be good, and so should your R-hop patch if you have an R-hop patch. If you don't have an R-hop patch, you just have a regular bucking, what I recommend doing is swapping this out whenever you notice a performance change that you can't fix from tuning. So, because I can't really recommend how often you should swap this, because sometimes you swap them once every 6 months, sometimes you swap them once every year. I end up swapping mine out about once every year. That's not because my gun produces a lot of wear on the hop-up bucking. That's just simply because I don't play as often as most people do. So I don't need to change as often. But the thing that wears out on hop-up buckings is not normally the inside of it that makes contact with the BB, in my experience, but it's the lips that make contact with the BB right in front of the air nozzle. So if I can get this out here real quick. It's these parts, right? It's this part right here, this lip that makes contact with the BB crack over time, it can be softened over time. What I always replace my hop-up buckings with is a Lonex 70 degree. The Lonex makes two hop-up buckings. They make a 70 degree and they make a 50 degree. The 50 degree is just softer than the 70 degree. I do prefer the 70 degree because the 70 degree, I feel like it holds up better over time, and on higher FPS builds, it creates a more consistent shot-to-shot FPS and range and accuracy. So I've always just stuck with the 70 degree. But you know, go with whatever you feel like is working best in your gun. But again, my experience has been the 70 degree works pretty good. And that's usually all I do just to hop up is just swap this out and obviously modify it to work with an R-hop because it doesn't come modified. And then yeah, make sure your barrel on the inside doesn't have any scratches down the center. I've noticed sometimes I'll look down my barrel and there's just a pretty good gash in it. Sometimes you just need to replace the barrel, sometimes you don't. If it's a cheap barrel, you might have to do that. If it's a higher quality barrel, you might. This is a ZCI barrel. It's more of a mid-tier quality barrel in my experience, and this one looks pretty good. It looks dirty, like I should just run a cleaning rod down it a couple times, and I'll do that when I replace the bucking. Don't run a cleaning rod down your back through your hop-up unit or forward and just mess up the bucking. Always take it apart completely to do that. That's what I've always done, because I've noticed that if you try to clean the barrel with a hop-up bucking in it, sometimes you can actually jack up those lips and mess them up and crack them and get them out of place. And then you have to take apart the hop-up unit to fix it anyway. So might as well take it apart, clean it, and then put it back together. Alright, now let's move on to the upper gearbox. Alright, I've got my upper taken apart, so let's go ahead and start talking about what I would do for maintenance here. So, a lot of maintenance that you do up top is more just looking and waiting for something to look like it's about to break so that you can replace it. Very little of what you do in the upper portion of the gearbox shell is kind of preventative. Or actual maintenance wise. So the first thing I want to take a look at, we'll start in the rear, is this spring guide here. This spring guide, you want to make sure that the ball bearings on it aren't actually starting to pop and loosen up. I've seen that a couple times. Spring guides will last a very, very long time. It'll take a long time for these things to actually break down. This spring guide's like 6 years old, and I've used it in like so many builds. And the bearings on it still rotate flawlessly. They don't crunch, or they don't refuse to rotate. So if you try to rotate them, they kind of crunch or they refuse. Just go ahead and swap it out. You don't want that to break and have some loose ball bearings floating around your gearbox shell. That would be absolutely horrible. So this one feels pretty good. Like I said, you want to put some grease in here, keep it running smoothly, and make sure that it's not going to break on you. So moving on, the spring should still feel pretty spongy. This one's a good spring. I believe this is a Prometheus style spring, or Prometheus brand spring, or modify. I can't tell. It's been a while since I've actually done a lot of airsoft stuff recently, as you guys know. So, but it does look like modified now that I kind of get a second look at it. This spring is good. I've not had a problem with it. I've never felt like it's any problem for me. But just replace springs on a per basis. So next thing I want to take a look at is this setup right here. Test your air seal and test your air seal over and over again. So let's test mine. Actually, this would be the first time I've tested it on camera. Yeah, it's pretty junk. It's pretty junk. So culprits here could be pretty simple. Let's actually remove some. Yeah, it's still junk. So this sounds like it's junk between my piston head and my cylinder. This cylinder isn't as high quality a cylinder, and that does tend to matter just a little bit. If you get like these really odd brand cylinders, like this is a ZCI cylinder, I just thought it was really cool looking, so I bought one. You can make almost any cylinder work, but you just want to make sure that you actually do get it to work. Because, like I said, these off-brand cylinders can be funny, but they can work, but they might not be as on spec as some of the nicer brand cylinders like Lonex or whatever. So now I got this thing off right here. You want to check this right here to make sure that the glue is not starting to fail on it. If this is how you correct AOE, then you definitely want to check that. So I tend to correct AOE on two sides. I add a little bit of a spacer here, and then I add a faucet washer or sorbothane on here. Usually I do end up adding faucet washers, Faucet washers are a little bit harder, they're a little bit more dense, they wear out less frequently, and the glue deteriorates on them less frequently as well, I've noticed. So if you use sorbothane, you're more likely to have to replace that because sorbothane doesn't really hold up over time very well. I think sorbothane is kind of a dying thing. I've not heard people do it a whole lot more, a whole lot recently. So moving on a little bit. So that air leak we were getting was probably as a result between the piston head and the cylinder. I remember when I was first putting this gun together, or putting this setup together, this air seal was very flawless. So what I'll probably end up doing is replacing this O-ring. It feels really stiff, it feels really nasty. So I'll replace it, and then I'll perfect my air seal. And I do have a video on that, so just go check that out. That's what you should be doing in this situation, and test your air seal to the way that I do it in that video as well. So moving on, these things right here, these air seal nozzles, the O-rings in them can kind of deteriorate and crack over time, but it's very rare that you have to actually replace that. I've almost never had to do that. Next thing, check your tappet plate. Make sure you don't have any abnormal amount of wear here. If you do, just go and replace it because it's going to create some feeding issues. Furthermore, this spring right here does tend to wear out. This is a shorter spring. I've clipped it just so that it feeds a little better for me and then returns to the hop-up unit before my gearbox shoots just a little bit more quickly. So just check it, make sure it doesn't look like it's too stretched. This one feels pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and keep it. Next thing you want to do is you want to check your gearbox shell corners and make sure that you're not having any cracking to start. If you have not radiused your gearbox, do so now. I do have a video on that. You should go check that out as well. Also check through here. Run a paper towel through here and kind of clean it up and make it nice and clean, and then re-grease it here. That's really about the only place you should be greasing up your gearbox shell besides your lubricants and your air seal components. Because right here you get a bunch of dirt and grime and just junk here and worn out piston shavings. So go ahead and clean that up and re-grease just a little bit through here. So yeah, let's take a look at one more thing here on the piston. The teeth, inspect your teeth, look at your pickup tooth and make sure it's not getting worn out too much. Then look at your follow-up teeth. If your pickup tooth is starting to wear out, you know, you can kind of push it a little bit further. This one, it's showing some wear, but it just looks like it's been used. It doesn't actually look like it's starting to get worn out to the point of not being able to use it. Usually your other teeth here are going to be fine. It's just that your pickup tooth and then the next tooth that the sector gear picks up on will also be a little worn. And that does tend to be the case with this piston. You will see like little spots where the teeth have been, but you shouldn't see any like actual wearing down unless your piston just really needs to replace. It's pretty rare to have to replace pistons in my experience. I used to run SHS 15 tooth steel pistons in all of my guns with the nylon body and the steel teeth. I thought that was the way to go. And then I thought, you know what, I didn't have an SHS piston on hand and I was building this gun, so I tossed this Lonex one with a couple metal teeth in, and it's been great ever since, and I've had it in this gun for the better part of 2 years, and it looks pretty good. So I'm sticking with this piston. I'm not going to replace it. I'll have to make a video on pistons later talking about why I started using these a little more in depth, or using this style piston a little more in depth. But yeah, this piston looks good. If it doesn't, just go ahead and swap it out and try to figure out why it's not working good. Alright, so in the lower portion of the gearbox shell, we have a decent bit to talk about here. Hopefully we can cover it relatively quickly though. So individually here, all these gears you need to inspect. You need to wipe them down and really get to looking at the teeth and make sure that nothing is cracked, or starting to shred or starting to wear down to build up dust in your gearbox shell. If that's the case, you need to figure out why. And if it's salvageable, then you can keep it, but just figure out why. So, like I said, inspecting each of the gear teeth and each of the gears and wiping them down and re-greasing them is in order. Do you have to re-shim? I get this question I used to get this question often. Do you need to re-shim your gears? No, but you need to recheck them. And if they need it, then you need to do it. So it's sort of a kind of case-by-case basis. Sometimes these shims do kind of wear out just enough to where your shimming is thrown off. And you might not even notice it by the sound of the gun. A majority of the sound that your gun produces will be between the bevel and the pinion, which that level shouldn't really wear out as much as the shims wear out of the sector and the spur changing their width in the gearbox show, or their side-to-side movement. That won't produce a lot of sound. So yeah, like I said, just inspect all your gears, check your shimming, make sure it's still solid. If it is, good for you. You did a really good job your first time. I do have a really good video on shimming, by the way, so you should check that out if you have not already. Always check your wires that run underneath your pinion gear and your bevel. Sometimes those get shredded, those get frayed pretty easily, so just make sure that those are doing good. If they are shredded, you're going to have to replace them. Or you might be able to get away with putting some heat shrink over them, but I would recommend replacing them, especially if you have a Chimera FET or something like this. You can put some glue down and kind of jam it in there if you never intend on removing this again. If you do, I wouldn't glue it, because if you glue it and you try to remove it, you're going to actually take off the insulation. So yeah, check all that, make sure these gears are solid. One thing you should do if you have something like this set up is you should grease this cutoff cam here, because if you don't, you know, BTC recommends that you grease this so that you don't build up too much wear between this and the cutoff detection system. What I was talking about down here though, for your electrical components, if you have a normal setup with like the trigger trolley and all that stuff, check your trigger contacts, make sure they're not getting burnt up, or they're not too they don't have too much carbon built up on them, they're not too much coated in that black junk that gets on them over time. If you're using high voltage batteries without MOSFET protection. If you are using MOSFET protection, more than likely your trigger contacts are still going to look good. I would, however, check on the trigger trolley itself. There is a little cam portion that the cutoff lever hits for your semi-auto. And so if that is worn out, then your semi-auto can be kind of hit or miss. If that's the case, I would just replace the trigger trolley and make sure that it functions well with your trigger housing. And yeah, other things to go over here, there's really not a whole lot. I would check your bushings. I do weld my bushings in, JB weld them in, and I'd recommend people do the same, weld or glue or whatever you want to do. Epoxy, whatever. I epoxy or JB weld them. JB weld is basically epoxy. But check those, make sure they're still solid. These are very solid. They were just jammed in there and held in there really tight. So those are good. Just make sure yours are good as well. If you have bearings, the same thing with the spring guide bearing applies to this. If they sound crunchy, if they don't sound good, try to clean them out and then re-grease them and then try them again. If they still sound a little crunchy and bad, and they don't turn super easily and nice like they used to, you should probably go ahead and replace them. If they have side-to-side wobble in them, absolutely replace them. Because if your bearings fail, then your gear train can fail pretty easily, and that can take a lot of stuff with it, so don't let that happen. Yeah, so there you have it. There's a video on some basic to intermediate level maintenance. Like I said, how often you should be doing this maintenance, it just really depends on your gun. If you have a super high stress DSG build, you should probably be doing maintenance every month or maybe more frequently, checking your gearbox out, making sure it's doing okay. If you have a more mid-tier stress build like this, then you can probably get away with every 6 months to a year. So yeah, I will see you guys in the next video. Thanks for watching.